Welcome, everybody, and thank you all for coming. I really do appreciate it, obviously, and I really enjoy it. So, of course, last session we talked about kind of brainstorming, getting an idea of what we are going to write. Today's session is the first part of two sessions where we talk about kind of planning out how you're going to write your essay. Some people say this is outlining. Other people can call it different things, but we're going to be talking about specifically a narrative structure and how to organize your essay around a narrative structure. All right, so again, the overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the importance of outlining, 4 groups of essay writers, an introduction to the 2 kinds of structures, 2 broad categories of structures, focus in on the narrative structure explanation, talk about 2 kinds of essays that you can find in this narrative structure, and then some examples and how to kind of plan out your essay with that in mind. We'll go over some practical advice, and then if we have some time, we will also take some questions. So just like brainstorming, outlining is a very important process of writing your essay. With brainstorming, you kind of arrive at these ideas, you plan out like, okay, here's a cool story. Here's something that I think is, very meaningful to me. And, oh, this is very interesting. But with outlining, what you're doing is you're taking these ideas and you're processing those ideas. Like, this is a great idea, but this is how I can turn this great idea into a coherent, structured essay that is answering the question that I'm being asked, that I can get started and write a draft about. And this is important because just like having an idea of what you're going to write about is going to help your writing, knowing how you are going to be writing your essay is also going to make that essay stand out. It's going to help your first draft be a lot more coherent and put together. And then, of course, it's going to make the revising process a whole lot easier as well. So there are really 4 kinds of essay writers or 4 kinds of essays. And so, 2 questions you should ask yourself, and we kind of discussed this last session, is do you have a significant challenge, right? So have you faced a significant challenge, or do you want to write about that challenge? And do you know what you want to study, or do you know what career you want to go into? Ask yourself those 2 questions. And then you will be put in one of these 4 categories. So for example, you're an A student if you have a significant challenge and you do know what you're going to do. You're a C student if you have a significant challenge but you're not sure what you want to do in the future. You're a B student if you haven't faced a significant challenge, or you aren't comfortable writing about it, or that's not what you want to write about in your essay, and you do know what you want to study. And you're a D student if you haven't faced significant challenges and you really don't know what you want to study. And if that's a lot, we'll go into that. And so don't feel like you have to get a grasp of all of that right now, because we're going to talk about that. But you should find yourselves in one of these 2 categories. And again, ask your question, have you faced a significant challenge? Do you know what you want to do in the future, whether that's career or something you want to study at university? Now, once you've placed yourself in one of these 2 categories, you'll find that a narrative structure is going to be much more appropriate if you're an A essay writer or a C essay writer. And a monologue approach, or a monologue structure, is going to be a lot more appropriate, or not monologue, but montage, excuse me, a montage approach if you're a B or D student. Okay, so what's a narrative and what's a montage structure? So again, I have monologue there on accident, but a narrative structure is simply you're structuring your essay cause and effect. So the events are causally related and one story leads to another. Whereas, again, I have monologue, but it should be montage structure. Events are kind of organized thematically, or basically there are events that happen in your life that have some kind of connecting element in all of them that kind of point you to some kind of conclusion, and you can write your essay around that. And today we're going to be focusing on narrative structure. And so again, don't feel as if you have to have the montage structure completely understood in your head. I just wanted to introduce that to you so you know why we're only addressing essay writers A and C today, and we'll address B and D next section. All right, so let's kind of dive into this narrative structure. What does a narrative structure look like? And if you've ever watched any kind of TV show, especially a kids TV show, they're all in this specific format, and you probably should learn about this specific format in your literature courses as well, right? So the key elements. So you begin with the status quo. So what are the way things are, right? So, I'm doing this. Then something happens, this inciting incident or something that changes what is going on. A challenge arises. Then, of course, the characters within the story are having to rise up against that challenge and address that challenge. Oftentimes what happens is the rakes are states, or there's a rising action, right? So oftentimes when you initially try to tackle a challenge, you fail at that challenge, and that failure is a way of rising the tension within the story, showing that the characters are struggling to find an answer, but are still going down the path of challenging this or of facing this challenge. But then there's also a turning point. There's a point where something happens. Maybe something clicks in the character's head where they change their approach, or they get over, a hump. And so they are able to take on this challenge. And so a key action is taken, or a key event occurs. Maybe something that was in the status quo changes in a way that allows them to overcome that challenge. Then you have the final act where things are getting sorted out, right? So maybe, for example, if you're watching, a Marvel movie, Thanos is defeated. And so the final act is, all these things, getting put back to place. If you watch Avengers Endgame, it's making sure all these different stones are put back in their timelines, where they need to be, And then, of course, 6 is the outcome. So what's the new status quo, right? So where are we left after this challenge, after this rising action, after this turning point, and after things have been sorted out? Where are we now? This is a way to organize your essay structure if you do have a challenge that you faced and you may or may not know what you want to do in the future. So this is how this might look with my specific story. If you were in the session last week, you'll remember that one of my challenges that I put down was that I used to struggle with stuttering. And so here's how I might organize or kind of think about my stuttering story in light of this kind of narrative structure. All right, so key elements, right? So I might start with a kind of, and then one thing that I want to point out as well is that organizing your essay in this way is not a science. So there's no one set. And so you can move pieces around in certain ways that make it so that it makes sense to you and the reader. But this is how I might start. So I might talk about how I used to be shy and lacked confidence, and I might give an example. So maybe it's in the first grade, whenever we went on the playground, I would, play by myself because I was afraid to approach other students on the playground. So that might be a specific instance where I'm like, okay, this is what happens. And then when I talk about my status quo, I talk about, okay, well, I lacked confidence. I didn't feel as if I could really carry myself. I was kind of reserved, kind of insular. And so I didn't interact with, or I interacted with, but didn't connect with other students and make a lot of friends. Okay, so then what am I trying to do, right? So what's the rising action? The rising action is that through all of this, I'm trying different ways to cope with my stuttering. I'm trying to put myself in more comfortable situations so that I can approach people, so that I can make friends. But then you qualify that and say, while that was good that I was trying to cope with my stuttering, I wasn't doing it in a beneficial way, because what I was doing was I was still reserving myself. I needed to be pushed out of my comfort zone. And I was pushed out of my comfort zone in a big way with the turning point, or the moment of truth, where Finally, I joined speech and debate at Carson-Newman. And then I talk about, the final act, what things were happening. I learned different strategies to control my stutter while continually challenging myself, right? So I was being pushed out of my comfort zone probably every day. And so that was one way where I was able to learn to control my stutter, but I was also able to do that in a very beneficial way instead of staying so insular and to myself. And then I could talk about what's the new status quo. So where am I now? I could talk about how, along with my confidence, I've gained a passion for advocating for and helping other people, which has pushed me to help students with applying to colleges, which is, of course, you all. So you can see how this narrative structure can be used to organize your specific story. And so how do we do this, and how do we connect this to what you want to study or the career that you want to have, or any other kind of category of things that your college is asking for? And then how do you connect that to, maybe you don't know what you want to study or what career you want to go into? How can you connect your challenge, your narrative to this, to who you want to be, or complete your essay? And this is how you do it. So if you're type A, which is that you have faced challenges and you know what you want to do, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to connect your challenges to your career through specific values. And we'll talk about what that looks like specifically. If you're type C, what you want to do is you want to talk about how you faced, and then again, this is if you face challenges, but you aren't sure what you want to do, you want to connect your challenges to the person you have become. Keep that in mind, and then we'll put a visual so that you can really understand what we're talking about here. But remember back to last session where we did the feelings and needs exercise, right? So you've got your challenges, you've got your effects, you've got your feelings, you've got your needs, you've got what I did, and then what I learned. And then for many of you, you should have that. And so I would honestly, if you have it near you, pull it out, because you're going to want to have it for this next part. Now, we're just going to do some slight modifications on this to kind of simplify it for us and help us make it into a story and really kind of bring it home so that we can write this essay. And here's how I want you to do this. Right, so if you are a type A person, again, you have a challenge, you have a career, you're going to want to modify that structure into challenges, effects, what you did, values, and then a career. For those who weren't here last session, this is what each category is. So challenge, obviously that is simply a challenge that you have faced, or you can list multiple challenges that you have faced throughout your life. All right, so with the effects, what are the material effects of those challenges? And I can even give you an example, right? So again, my challenges, or one of my challenges was stuttering. Material effects, I didn't speak much. All right, what I did, I joined speech and debate. All right, what are the values that I got from this? So in the essence, who was the person that I became through this challenge and what I did? Well, I gained values of advocacy and mentorship. Now, for those who went through this last year, this last part may be a little bit different. But what I want you to do is, if you have a kind of area of study or a career, put this in the last column. So for example, let's say I want to become a professor. What you want to do is you want to say, what are the values that embody a good professor? Or what is something that embodies a good political science major? Or if you're learning engineering, what embodies a good engineering major? Whatever you're majoring in, what are the characteristics that really embody that person? And so for me, I say a good professor has patience and knowledge. Now, if you don't have a career in mind, then simply stop with values, right? You could just stop with everything that we have here. And so what I want you to do is, I know like Rashan said, we have some people from the last session, but if you aren't from the last session, we're going to take some time for you to kind of think through this, because I think this is very, very important, and it really sets you up for a very good essay. So what I want to do is, again, I want to spend 5 to 10 minutes of you thinking through this. And for those who have already done this, what I want you to do is, again, I want you to put yourself in one of these categories. And then what I want you to do is I want you to reorganize what you have on your paper into this kind of a format. And you might want to pick 1 or 2 challenges, but reorganize what you have for your feelings and needs exercise, or completely start over into this kind of a format. So I'll put 5 to 10 minutes on the clock. I will be monitoring the chat, and so I will be answering questions during this time. But again, take some time, focus in on this aspect. If you've already done the feelings and needs exercise, this should be a lot simpler for you. Organize it into these categories. If you're just doing this for the first time, again, pick which one you're in. Are you a type A essay writer, or are you a type C essay writer? And then organize your paper into these vertical columns and answer these questions. And I think we have a yes. So I think Rashan at least put me put in the chat. We have a significant amount of time for this. So again, feel free to ask questions. I think she pointed out, and I think this is actually very, very true. This can be a difficult thing to grasp, especially if, you know, this is your first time or you're just kind of being exposed to this. So feel free to ask questions. There really is no rush at all. Yes, so I would write it. And so here, this is what I would do here. This is what I would do. Let me move this chat out of the way. So I would get a sheet of paper like this, and then I would break it up into vertical columns. So of course, if you're a type A person, you're going to have 5 columns. If you're a type C person, you're only going to have 4. And so of course, each column is going to be, you know, one of these things. If you're a type A person, you're going to have challenges, effects, what I did, values, and then your career or what you want to study. For a type C person, what I want you to do is have 4 columns: values, what I did, challenges, effects, what I did, and then values, or the person you have become. And so I again want to kind of go through some guiding questions on challenges. So what are challenges that you find significant? What are things that, you know, you faced in the past that you've overcome? And I think this is an important thing to consider, is that oftentimes people, yes, there can absolutely be several challenges. And I think somebody asked, can we mix 2 writing styles? Absolutely, absolutely, you can. Like I said, this is not a science. And so there's a lot of leeway for you to make this, you know, your own, to make it personal for you. So absolutely, you can mix 2 different writing styles. And then definitely have multiple challenges in there, because they can all feed off of one another, but also put those different challenges down there, because maybe we have a challenge and then we're like, oh, I really don't know how to write about this yet, because we still might be in the challenge. And so it's a lot harder to write about a challenge when you're still processing what you're going through. And so I think it's important to write down multiple challenges, because it will help you get a list of challenges, a list of stories that you can actually work with. And once you have some challenges, again, take your time, spend time thinking about these challenges, move on to the effects. Now the effects, what I want you to do here is, you know, you can put feelings in here. What I want you to do here is, I want you to really think about differentiating your story from other stories, but also making it concrete, right? So for example, with stuttering, in my last slide, you saw that in my effects, I put lack of confidence. But what I also put in my effects column was I didn't speak as much. So that's a very concrete thing that happened as a result of my stuttering problem. So in the effects category, put the concrete effects that you had because of your challenges. And once you've done that, think about, how can I differentiate my story from other students? Because different students can have similar challenges, but different effects to those challenges. For example, one of my other challenges that I put on the last slide was that my faith was being challenged. All right, so one of those effects was I was restless and I was, studying a lot. Again, that's a concrete thing, right? I was studying a lot. But maybe somebody else says that they were motivated, that they weren't restless at all. They were excited to kind of take this on. And so what effects did you have? And see, what of those effects are unique to me? Then we have challenges. What are those that you faced? And then the effects. What are the direct outcomes or the direct results of those challenges? Okay, yes. Yes, thank you. Yes. And I'm not sure if you saw that, Nur, but Rashan said for this, focus on one. Focused on one challenge, and that worked just fine. All right. And the next, what did you do about that challenge? Again, for me, I joined speech and debate. And this is, again, kind of like your turning point, right? So what happened that kind of changed everything about you? Values. What was the person that you became? So for example, through my stuttering, I became someone who was passionate about advocacy, about helping others. I also became passionate about mentoring others as well. Now, here's one thing that I want you to consider here as you do your values as well. Think of unpredictable values, right? So if I was to look at my challenge stuttering, right? I mean, one of the values, you could see how a value of that could be, being able to speak in front of people, having a passion for speaking in front of people, or advocacy. But many people wouldn't expect a value to come from being mentorship, right? That's kind of unexpected, kind of unpredictable. And you're like, wait, how did you gain the value of mentorship through your challenge? And here's a good exercise for brainstorming unpredictable values. Think of some values that you could have, and then say, would Thomas expect this from my challenge, right? So look at your challenge and then give me a value. You don't have to do it in chat, but this is a mental exercise, and say, would Thomas or even Roshan expect me to connect these two? And the more unpredictable that connection is, the more interesting that is going to be to write about, but also more interesting it is going to be to read about. And then, of course, with your career, if you're a type C person, don't worry about this because you don't have this yet. But if you're a type A person, what are characteristics of somebody going into your profession or into your area of study that is important to have? So, and then I'll answer some questions with regards to challenge. I'm not sure what somebody asked, could it be positive or negative? Usually I would say, so a challenge, I think, is always something that is, it can be positive in the sense that it has good effects for us, right? Or it benefits us in some way in the end. But a challenge should be something that we had to overcome. So it shouldn't be, for example, the challenge shouldn't be something that was like, I was given $1 million and I had to figure out how to spend $1 million. Like that shouldn't be your challenge. It should be something that was relatively hard to overcome. Yes, Diaz, that can be a significant challenge. And then someone says you haven't faced a significant challenge. Well, what I would say is if you haven't faced a significant challenge, I think probably everybody has faced a challenge that has really shaped their lives. And I think conscious reflection on that will kind of bring that out. But if you haven't, we have other essay formats, and we'll be talking about that that next week with B and D. But if you haven't faced a significant challenge, spend the rest of this time absorbing what other people are saying in the chat and what I'm going to be discussing, because we're going to be going over essay examples and some other strategies to use as you're writing your essay. So again, stay engaged and be thinking about what you're going to be writing about. So what can be considered a challenge? Anything that you think is a challenge. And I think this is very, very important, because I think sometimes people denigrate their challenges saying, this is not something that, some people talk about, a divorce, or some people talk about, some very traumatic event that occurred during their life. Your story doesn't have to have that. I mean, for example, like I talk about my faith being challenged, right? That was very, very meaningful to me, but that's something that is not unique to me at all. That has happened, every human has basically had that experience, but you can make that meaningful if you believe that that is meaningful, right? So what's a challenge? Whatever you consider to be a significant challenge. And this is something and this is an important question as well. Can I write a story um, that may highlight, some of your weak sides or your bad sides? For me, I think any challenge will highlight things that you struggle with. Now, what I think is important is that you don't come out the other side with, and this can be hard because oftentimes we still struggle with different things, right? So stuttering, right? Like I've learned techniques that have helped me cope with that. But does that mean that I never stutter? Does that mean that I never face that challenge again? Obviously not. But what I think is important with your question about, can my story be about my weak points or bad sides? You always want there to be a positive picture of you that is painted at the end of it, right? So if I read your essay and I come away with that you are egotistical, that you don't like helping other people, or something like that, like that's not what I want to come away with. Now you can talk about how you had to struggle with those feelings and maybe you are still fighting that, but I need to get a positive picture of who you have become. Someone who maybe who is ready and able to fight against their own faults, to seek out help from others to overcome that. So again, you can point to negative aspects of you, but don't leave yourself with a negative picture for the reader. All right, so what I want you to do is we spent a significant amount of time on that. And so kind of finish up what you're doing. If you've written multiple and you're still having, you haven't finished one, focus on one and finish that one for just this exercise. All right, and I'll give you maybe 20 more seconds to finish that up very, very quickly. And I think what this should show you as well is how important this brainstorming process is. All right. So here are some things to remember. I kind of discussed some of these, but I do want to go back through them very, very quickly so you can spend this time just reflecting on what you've written. Challenges, what you find significant. Again, it's what you find significant. Effects, there can be multiple effects. Try to differentiate them from others because we all have different experiences. And what you did, this is the most important part of your essay, because while the challenge is important, what's important to a reader, to the person at your university, is how do you deal with challenges? And the way you deal with this specific challenge that you write about is going to tell a lot about who you are as a person and who you've become as a person. And so what you did is probably one of the most important things. It's far more important than your challenge, although your challenge is, of course, very, very important. Again, values. What values did you develop? Who did you become? And in order to find or to kind of brainstorm unpredictable values, think of some values. Look at the list from last session and see which values fit your story and say, would Thomas predict, if I was to tell Thomas my challenge, would he predict or could he see the connection immediately between my challenge and this value? Because the more kind of unpredictable that connection is, the more interesting it can be to read. And then, of course, what are the essential qualities of whatever you're looking to describe or become? All right, so along with the structure of, narrative monologue, there's a kind of different structure or a kind of outline that we can adopt for our essay. Respond to this very, very quickly. And this is both a way to kind of organize your outline and a way to think about your essay overall. So this is a very simple structure that is not very hard to grasp. So here's how you could write your essay. You could spend a third to a half of your essay describing your challenge, going over your challenge. What was that challenge? And of course, like I said, you never want to use over half of your essay discussing your challenge, because like I said, what's important is what you did to address that challenge. Then spend a third of your essay discussing what you did. Then finally, a third of your essay discussing what you learned. And that could be either, if you're a type A person, describing how that applies to your career, or if you're a type C person, just describing how that has impacted you as a person. Right? So this is a very simple structure, but we can also expand this into using a narrative structure. We can expand this into using the narrative structure that I had given with my story, with my example, in this way. So we can start with an inciting incident. And again, I just want to reiterate this just at the beginning of this explanation, which is that this isn't something that you have to fit it in exactly how this is. You can move around with it, and we'll see how students move around with it with some examples, essays. But this is a good structure to start with that you can then modify to fit your needs. So we start with an inciting incident. What is something that happened in your story that was significant, that brought about the challenge that you faced? And oftentimes this can be the worst thing that happened or the most challenging thing that happened to you in this story. Next, you want to contextualize this. So you want to say, okay, well, this thing happened, but here's why it's important. Here's why it's important. Where was my family at that made this incident so important? And here I want to point out is that if you look back a couple of slides, what you'll see is that we actually did the reverse of this. We put status quo before we did inciting event. Now, the reason we are switching that up in this outline that I'm giving you now is because oftentimes it is better for a reader to start reading with an inciting incident. That's going to grab their attention, and that's going to make them invested into your story. But once we've given the status quo, why this is important, or what's the kind of context in which this incident occurred, we're going to talk about raising the stakes. What are some challenges that you faced in trying to overcome this challenge? What was hard to do? Again, and what this should do is it should show your reader that you're trying to overcome this challenge and oftentimes not succeeding or having troubles doing that. But then you have a turning point. There's a point in time where things change. And then this is, of course, what you did, right? Because what you did is going to be the thing that's like, oh, okay, I took the initiative, I took action in kind of bringing about this change. Once you have that, then you have the final act, which is not only what you did about it, but also how did this kind of whole thing evolve, right? So my turning point was I joined debate. Well, what was the final act? What was the kind of concluding aspect of that? Was I was learning skills that I could use to control my stutter. The next part of that is what is the new status quo? So where are you at as a person? And this is where you would bring in your values. You would say, now I'm a person who cares about advocacy and mentorship, and this is why I want to help students with their college essays. That's how you could do that. Now here I also want to point out is that although we have these 6 aspects, you really want to focus in on, so be proportional with each aspect that you approach, right? So we said 1/3 of your essay should be your challenge. So 1, 2, and 3, they're really describing your kind of challenge. So inciting incident, status quo, raising the stakes should be around 1/3 to a half of your essay. And of course that can change because, don't be so tied to that number that you can't change it, but that should be around where you keep that aspect of your essay. Now with your turning point and final act, that should also be around 1/3 of your essay where you're describing what you did and what you learned. And the new status quo, that should be around 1/3 of your essay because you're talking about who you are as a person now. And one advice or one way to look at these different things is that use an example, use a real life example to put forward your point. And again, we'll talk about writing, in the future, but one way to think about this. So for example, let's say that your new status quo is that you are somebody who values advocacy, right? So you can talk about, of course, how that value developed. Now talk about how you embody that value. So for example, I joined a club that was advocating for environmentally friendly policies at our school. And so that was, again, you show your kind of development, you have this value of advocacy, but also what does that look like for you in a concrete way? Yes, absolutely, it is a challenge. All right, and so now we're going to take some time. We're going to look at some essays and then discuss how they're working, what they're doing, and then we're going to spend some time also for you to kind of plan out that kind of a structure as well. But I think it's important to see what an essay looks like to see how does this work. I think the best way to do this is for me, if you are better at reading it and you just want to go ahead and read, feel free to mute me as I read this. but I feel that it'd be good for us to all be on the same page if I was to just read it out loud together. But again, if you want to move on and read quicker than I, feel free to do that. I completely understand that wholeheartedly. So this is a sample essay with debate, and this is type A, so they have a challenge and they know what they want to study. The clock was remarkably slow as I sat, legs tightly crossed, squirming at my desk. Just raise your hand, my mind pleaded, ask. But despite my urgent need to visit the restroom, I remained seated, begging time to move faster. You see, I was the type of kid to eat French fries dry because I couldn't confront the McDonald's cashier for some Heinz packets. I was also the type to sit crying in front of school instead of asking the office if it could check on my late ride. Essentially, I chose to struggle through a problem if the solution involved speaking out against it. My diffidence was frustrating, or his lack of confidence. My parents relied on me, the only one able to speak English, to guide them, and always anticipated the best from me. However, as calls for help grew, the more defunct I became. I felt that every move I made, it was a gamble between success and failure. For me, the fear of failure and disappointment far outweighed the possibility of triumph, so I took no action and chose to silently suffer under pressure. Near meltdown, I knew something needed to be done. Mustering up the little courage I had, I sought ways to break out of my shell without luck. Recreational art classes ended in 3 boring months. I gave up self-defense after embarrassing myself in class. After school band, library volunteering, and book clubs ended similarly. Continued effort yielded nothing. Disillusioned and wrung dry of ideas, I followed my mom's advice and joined a debate club. As expected, the club only reaffirmed my self-doubt. Eye contact, greater volume, no thanks. But soon the club moved on from how to make a speech lessons to the exploration of argumentation. We were taught to speak the language of persuasion and play the game of debate. Eventually, I fell in love with it all. By high school, I joined the school debate team, began socializing, and was even elected to head several clubs. I developed critical and analytical thinking skills and learned how to think and speak spontaneously. I became proud and confident. Moreover, I became eager to play my role in my family, and family relations strengthened. In fact, nowadays, my parents are interested in my school's newest gossip. 4 years with debate, and now I'm the kid up at the whiteboard, the kid leading discussions, and the kid standing up for her beliefs. More importantly, I now confront issues instead of avoiding them. It is exciting to discover solutions to problems that affect others, as I was able to do as a part of the first place team for the 2010 United Nations Global Debates Program on climate change and poverty. I take a natural interest in global issues and plan to become a foreign affairs analyst or diplomat by studying international affairs with a focus on national identity. In particular, I'm interested in the North-South Korean tension. What irreconcilable differences have prompted a civilization to separate? Policy implications remain vague, and sovereignty theories have their limits. How do we determine what compromises are to be made? And on a personal level, why did my grandfather have to flee from his destroyed North Korean hometown, and why does it matter? I see a reflection of myself and the divide at the 38th parallel because I see one part isolating itself in defense to outside threats, and another part coming out to face the world as one of the fastest developing nations. Just as my shy persona before debate and the extroverted character after debate are both part of who I am, the Korean civilization is also one. And just as my parents expect much from me, the first of my family to attend college, I have grand expectations for this field of study. So with that, we can discuss aspects of that essay, right? So here again, we can see how this author, how this student has kind of changed this essay. And so we'll kind of discuss the overall structure or the outline of this essay And then we'll go into some more particular aspects of it. So what was the narrative structure of this essay? So what we can see is that the author started with an introductory event. So, right, so this idea of, we can go back here, of the clock was remarkably slow at first, and then how he was sitting patiently to use the restroom because he didn't want to ask, right? Like, that's not the inciting incident where the challenge arose, but this was an interesting way to start the discussion about where he was. Where he was he lacked confidence because he was scared to speak out. Then how did he raise the stakes, right? And again, this is all done very, very quickly, right? So if we go back, the status quo was set up in this first paragraph, right? Because basically the end of that was essentially, I chose to struggle through a problem if the solution involved speaking out against it. Boom, that's status quo. That was a very quick explanation of where you are as a status quo. Then raising the stakes, right? So we tried different things like art classes and self-defense classes, but they all failed. Now the turning point for him, or what might be considered the inciting incident in this essay, was when his mom pushed him to join debate club, right? Again, he thought that this would be another failure, that he wouldn't, really think anything of this debate club, but it actually ended up being very, very impactful and important to him. And of course, we can see this in the final act where he talks about these different skills he gained and what he learned from the process. And then, of course, his new status quo is he discusses, this is the career that I want to have, and this is what I'm passionate about as it relates back to what I discussed, right? So we can look back at this, right? So we can see how, maybe looking back at this essay, the first thing that I want to point out is that we can see this 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 structure. So the first three paragraphs, those are all the challenge, right? That's what he faced: status quo, rising action. The next thing was, of course, his mother pushed him to join debate. That was the turning point, what changed for him. And then that goes all the way until the mid part of this third paragraph, right? So I would say that kind of what he did and what he learned goes all the way up until where he says he became the first place team for the 2010 UN Global Debates Program on Climate Change and Poverty. I'll say it goes all the way up until then. And then what he does then is he switches it for the last third of his essay, where he says, I take natural interest in global issues and plan to become a foreign affairs analyst or diplomat. And he kind of goes on. But that's the new status quo, what he wants to do. And so we can see how he's kind of transitioned this essay in this narrative structure while using both kind of structures, right? He's used a simple structure to organize his overall essay, but he's used a kind of narrative structure specifically to look at each part of his essay, right? So we have the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 structure: challenge, what I did, what I learned, where I'm at, and what I'm doing if you're a type A essay writer. But we also have the narrative structure, right? We have a status quo. We have, raising the stakes, rising action, things are getting harder. We have a turning point or an inciting incident. We have a final act, and of course we have a new status quo. So again, what we see here is the simple structure, but also the more specific structure as well. All right, so now we'll move on to the next example essay, and this is a type C essay, type C, right? So he's not going to say, I want to go into this career, I want to study this. So this is going to be one of those where he doesn't have that, but he still has a significant challenge. Every weekend, my family and I go to the bowling alley. We either go to Lucky Strike in Orange County, to 300 in Pasadena, or the AMF Bowlodrome in Torrance. It's been a tradition for us ever since I turned 11. But here's a secret. I've never bowled a game in my life. I began going when I was 11 because that's when I was told enough to adroitly wipe down a table, which just means just to wipe down a table well, and spray Windex on a window without making a mess. Every Saturday night from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., after entering the bowling alley through a back door, my parents dispatched my older sister Marlene and me to the lanes armed with broomsticks. Try to clean around the bowlers, she always says. We always do. In 2003, my family's stability was put to the test when my father suffered an accident. He was bitten by a horse and unable to work for 3 years. Some months later, my year-old baby sister was hit by a car. My mother was our only financial support, so we often ate cups of noodles for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I prayed every night that things got better, but first they got worse. In the 11th grade, my father suffered a muscle failure, and my mother was diagnosed with a tumor. Due to my parents' health problems, I took on more responsibilities, sometimes missing school to care for my younger sisters and helping my father and mother at their work. Unfortunately, I pushed myself so hard that I ended up hurting myself, suffering a vein leakage in my brain. I was the fighter, the protector. Now I found myself needing someone to protect me. I was glad to have my mother by my side because she gave me the strength I needed. After some rest, I returned to school more focused than ever on preparing for my future. I got involved in the Leadership Council, where I now am part of the Civics Committee, planning events such as Day at the Park and school dances. I've also become a big supporter of the Gay Straight Alliance that deals with anti-bullying, and through this club, I've given presentations that addressed unfairness and promote equity. But perhaps my biggest support system has come through the 4 years on my high school soccer team, where my commitment and love for soccer won me the captain position for the past 2 years. I know I'm not like many students my age, but I'm happy with who I am. I am the student who works on the weekends scrubbing restrooms, carrying trash bags, and mopping kitchen floors. I'm the student who won't give a second thought to missing a party to help my parents babysit my sisters or accompanying them to a new job. I know that one day I will not take my family to a bowling alley to clean it, but to enjoy it. And who knows, maybe one day I will learn to bowl. It's a pretty powerful story. But before we go into the more specifics of that story, with regards to the way this student wrote this essay, let's go into the kind of structure that this person took towards this essay. Right. So again, this author starts with the attention, like getting the attention of the reader, about how the student was going to these bowling alleys, but he wasn't going to learn to bowl or to have fun, but to clean the bowling alleys, to work so that their family could have extra money to make ends meet. Right. So he starts with an attention getting device is what we call it. Then he goes into the status quo. Right. So where were my families at this point? The student's family had gone through a series of unfortunate events and was not doing well. But then we get, things even worsen, right? The inciting event. The student had serious health issues because he was spending so much time helping out his family, doing all these things. He suffered a brain injury. So he raises the stakes, right? That's raising the stakes, right? So status quo, family was going through issues. Inciting incident, he had to be put in charge of many of these responsibilities. Raising the stakes, he hurt himself and got a brain injury, which made it far worse. But the turning point was when he was able to get back to school, right? So he goes back to school. He has a passion for focusing on his studies, on helping other people. And so that kind of illustrates who he is as a person, because that's how he reacts to this challenge. And so the final act, he's kind of tying all these loose ends together, right? So he talks about how he joined groups that promoted anti-bullying, how he promoted fairness and equity, and he built community and character because of his passion for helping other people and for building up himself as a person. And then his new status quo is that he is trying to build a better life for himself and his family. So again, there are slight variations on the format here of the narrative structure that we went over, but largely it's there. Now, one thing that I want to point out with regards to this specific essay is that, right, we talked about the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 structure. Here we see a little bit of a different kind of structure, right? So we have a 1/4 of his essay is just about getting the attention of the reader. Another 1/4 of the essay is about laying out the challenges that he faced and what happened to him, both status quo, inciting incident, raising the stakes, or rising action. But then a 1/4 of the essay is about how what he did with this challenge, how he addressed the challenge. And then the last 1/4 of the essay is all about who he become in light of the challenge and what he did. And then he ends, of course, on a good line. And who knows, maybe one day I will learn to bowl. So we see all these structures that we've discussed in this specific essay. And you might, one thing that you might be thinking to yourself is, my story, you might be thinking of a few things. The first thing you might be thinking is, my story is not as heart-wrenching as some of these stories. And the reality is that you don't have to have a heart-wrenching story in order for you to have a meaningful story. My stuttering story, is that something that is heart-wrenching? I would say that this person went through a far more significant challenge than I did with stuttering. But does that mean that my stuttering challenge is not a meaningful challenge and is not a challenge that I can make into a very good essay? Absolutely not. And I think one thing you can't do, obviously you want to be real with yourself and say, maybe my challenge, maybe I shouldn't write about this specific challenge, and that's totally fine. But if you find a challenge that is very, very meaningful for you, then that is a challenge that you can likely turn into an essay. Now, the next thing that you're going to be looking at is, wow, he used a lot of language there that I do not know, or how do we format a good attention-getting device? How do we, there's so much stuff there that he did technically with his essay that, I don't think I could do on my first run through, or I don't know how I'm going to get to that point. And the reality is that this author probably went through many revisions of this essay. It wasn't that he or she sat down, and this was the first draft of the essay they wrote out. And so you should set for yourself reasonable expectations for you to have, which is that you are likely not going to be able to write like that on your first draft. I would not be able to write like that on my first draft. There is going to be a revising process that is going to help you narrow down what you're saying, change the specific structures of sentences, and help you build up the language and the structure that is going to help you write a good essay. So keep that in mind. Don't let the kind of flashiness of a lot of these essays really throw you off, because they are flashy, because they spent time in developing them, in writing them, and then, of course, in revising them. Now, one thing that I noticed as I was reading that I did want to point out to you all is that here on this page, with bowling, in this first paragraph, last sentence, he says, "But perhaps my biggest support system has come through the 4 years on my high school soccer team, where my commitment and love for soccer won me the captain position for the past 2 years." There are 2 points I want to make on this. The first is that this author describes his time playing soccer as perhaps the biggest support system he has had throughout his high school career. But he only gave that, the biggest support system he had during his high school career, he only gave that part one sentence. And so what I want you to think about here is that you might have key aspects to many of your stories and things that you find important about your story. But remember, you can't include all of this into your story. And so narrow down what you want to include. But also what I want you to think about is what he did at the latter part of the sentence, where he says, my commitment and love for soccer won me the captain position for the past 2 years. And what's important here is he talks about a value that he has, and he backs it up with how it looked like in his real life. And so what I want you to do is, as you think about your values, as you think about your career, think about concrete ways in which you can apply those values to your life. So for example, if I was talking about mentorship in my essay, about how I embody mentorship, one way I could show that I'm mentoring other students is maybe point to me doing this, or point to me leading sessions at Speech and Debate, teaching the newer freshmen how to debate. That would be a way that I can illustrate, look, I hold to the value of mentorship, but here's an example of me doing mentorship, right? Back up the things that you say. Again, this is kind of getting more into the nitty-gritty of it, but these are important things that I think you should keep in the back of your mind as you're thinking about the essays, the essay that you're going to write. Now, with that in mind, I want to give some practical advice, and then we can go into a time of active reflection for you in looking at a challenge and trying to plan out your essay. So here is some practical advice. Again, feel confident in your narrative. And you know what? At this point, if you feel confident after we've kind of done some conscious reflection, you could start writing. Now, remember, that's going to be a very rough draft, and there will be significant revisions that are going to be made. But it's always good to put pen to paper so that you have an idea of what you're working with. Remember that a challenge should be no more than half of your essay. And with regard to some practical things, is make sure that you break up your essay. We talked about the simple structure about how we should have a challenge, what you did, and what you learned. I think it's often very easy for us to start to basically take these clearly defined categories and just push them together. Because it's so easy for someone to say, my mom broke her arm, so I started to take care of the chickens. Well, you've kind of ruined your story in some sense, because you've told your reader what you did right after your challenge. You need some time to develop the challenge, talk about why it's important, and then go into what you did. So don't put these together. Now, let's say you have multiple challenges and multiple things that you did. Again, something that could happen is that you start mishmashing these together. And so don't jump back and forth between challenge and what I did. What you need to do is you need to set a clear delineation in your essay and say, this is what I'm going to talk about my challenge. And if you're like, well, it'd be hard for me to put this in a way that I don't mention what you did, work around that. Really try to brainstorm how you can talk about your challenge without giving away what you did in light of that challenge, right? So first part of your essay, dedicate that first part to your challenge. Don't talk about what you did in that first part. It's going to confuse your reader, and it's going to take away from the impact of your story. Then talk about what you did and spend time on what you did. Don't go back and talk about your challenge. Now, you can talk about why that was hard for you. That's completely okay. But focus in on what you did. And then lastly, focus in on what you learned, and don't muddy the waters of all of these different things. And again, the important thing here is that this becomes a whole lot easier to do when you go into writing with a set outline. So I know that was a lot of information, and as Rashawn said, like, this is a very complex issue that will take time for you to kind of get to know and get involved. And so what I want to do here is I want to take initial questions. And so if you have something that you really don't know, then we'll go into initial questions. But then what I want to do is I want to spend the rest of this time us just going, you know what, actually, I think it would be better is if we go into conscious reflection, and then through that, we can ask questions of each other and of me and of Rashawn, and then we can answer those questions in the chat. So at this point, what you should have in front of you right now is that you should have what we went over towards the beginning of the session, which is that you have, if you're type A, you should have 5 columns. If you're type C, you should have 4 columns. At this point, what I want you to do is now have a sheet long ways. And I want you to organize your sheet into these 6 categories of inciting incident, status quo, raise the stakes, turning point, final act, and new status quo. And what I want you to do is I want you to look at your horizontal sheet and try to fill in what these are. And then, of course, throughout this, I will be answering questions in the chat. So somebody asked, what is a status quo? And that's a good question, very good question. If you have questions about terminology, feel free to ask that to me, because that's a very, very important question to ask. With regards to the status quo, that's basically just the context in which this occurred. For example, the way I think about it is, if you've ever watched a Marvel movie, so maybe you watched Endgame, but this can apply to many other Marvel movies. But if you watch a Marvel movie, what you'll see is that the beginning part of the movie is just them, hanging out, doing different things, right? In Endgame, they're all like, half of all of living life is destroyed. So they are coping with that reality, right? So that is the status quo of that story. So for you, what is the status quo of your story? For example, if let's say your challenge is a divorce, right? So maybe your status quo at that point was the time before the divorce. Maybe you thought you had a good relationship with your parents. Maybe it was that it was a rocky relationship, and then the inciting incident was the point in time when you had that divorce. And if that did not make sense, please ask some clarifying questions as well. Someone asked, what is considered a significant challenge? The way I would put that again is that I would consider it a significant challenge if you consider it a significant challenge, because we all come from different places in our life. And so simply because our story isn't heartbreaking or some kind of like heart-wrenching story like it was for the one student who had like a brain injury and had all these problems, simply because our story was not as heart-wrenching as that story does not mean it's not worth telling. And I know this isn't, the reality is that there's no, checklist to tick off for a challenge. I mean, there might be one out there as a resource, but I think the best way to think about that is, do you consider that challenge to be significant enough? So for example, like for many people, their whole faith being challenged, they'd be like, yeah, I mean, that happened, but I got over it pretty quickly, and that really wasn't, that wasn't a significant challenge for me. For me, that was a significant challenge, and that has shaped me to a significant degree, as you can see by the fact that I'm a philosophy major at my university, because I really believe that that was something that was very challenging and very important to me. So again, I hope that answered your question. Absolutely. Thank you for basically putting everything that I said into a nice sentence. Thank you. I can't read your name, but it says, that's what I put in the chat. I guess the main point here is not the story, but how it affected you. Absolutely. I mean, again, the story is important, but how it affected you and what you did is so much more important than that. And again, you should be using this time to really to fill out what you think this should look like. Inciting event, status quo, raise the stakes, turning point, final act, new status quo. Jackson, gotcha. Thank you, Jackson. Use this time to be thinking through that. And again, I and Rashawn are here to answer any clarifying questions that you have, because the questions we've gotten so far have been fantastic. Thank you for asking them. Yes, I sure can. So I think the turning point and final act, they are very much related. And sometimes it can be hard to distinguish between them. And the one thing that I would remind you of is that the turning point and final act usually go together in an essay anyway. So there's no need to specifically, in your essay point out like this was the turning point. But there should be an event or something that you did that was a turning point. And the turning point was simply just the event or action that you took. And the way I would describe the final act are the results of that action that you took. So for example, in my story, my turning point was joining the speech and debate team at Carson-Newman. The final act of that would be the results of that was that I learned strategies to cope with my stuttering problem. I gained the values of advocacy and mentorship, and I was able to live those out by advocating on behalf of policies that I believed in, and mentoring younger debaters, teaching them how to debate and advocate for things that they believed in. That would be the final act. And my new status quo is that I now have a passion for advocacy and mentorship, and I have the skills to do that as well. And of course, if you're a type A person, you would, in your new status quo, talk about how this is preparing you for your life in your career or your study. Yeah, no, that actually, that's a fantastic idea. Yes, no, that makes sense. Absolutely. Thank you, Rashawn. So with regards to the bowling essay, so we have these three sections. We've got inciting incident, status quo, rising action or raising the stakes, turning point, final act, and then status quo. So again, with this essay, the first part of this essay where the author is talking about every weekend my family went to the bowling alley and basically just describing what they would do at the bowling alley. That is not really an inciting incident because that's not what changed, what caused this problem or the challenge that he's describing, but it's something that occurred during his challenge. That was something that he found very, very important and something that would grab the attention of the reader. So that's not an inciting incident per se, but it's a way to introduce what is going on. Now, for this reader, for this student, I would argue that this next part where they talk about in 2003, my family stability was put to the test. I think this was actually a part of the status quo here, because as you can see from their initial story is that this entire thing is showing that their family is going through hardship. And so when the author talks about the challenges that his family faced, that's all explaining the status quo, which is their family is going through hard times. And what I believe to be the status quo is simply where they are at. So basically, what is going on with them. So for example, in this story specifically, the status quo, or what is going on for this family, is that they are having a lot of issues, right? They're having to go clean bowling alleys for funds. His father got into an accident and couldn't work for 3 years. His year-old baby sister was hit by a car. His mother was his only financial support. So all of these are not the challenge that he's going to be writing about, but rather just setting the context of his entire story, which is that his family has had a lot of issues. And then for me, I think the inciting incident was in the next paragraph, because, right, he says, but first they got worse, where he talks about how he himself was taken out of commission, essentially, because through all his family's hardship, he was put in a position of responsibility to really act as someone to take care of the family in many ways. But when he had the incident of suffering a brain injury, he was put out of commission, right? He was put out of commission. And so for me, that's the challenge that he's going to be talking about, how he's dealing with, in the sense of not being able to do anything for his family. So we've kind of got the rising action. For me, I would say the rising action is, kind of built into this part of the essay to begin with, because we see that things are getting worse, but then he was put out of commission as well. And so, again, we can see introduction, which was really just getting the attention of the reader. The paragraph in 2003, kind of status quo. Paragraph in the 11th grade, my father, blah, blah, blah. That was in some way rising action, but really introducing what was for me the inciting incident, which was his brain injury. Once we've got that, for me, what was the turning point? For me, the turning point for him was when he was able to get some rest, recover, and then be able to return to school more focused than ever, ready to make sure that he made his family proud, in essence. Yes. And so again, there, after some rest, that paragraph is simply dedicated to the turning point and to the final act. And the last paragraph is dedicated to just the new status quo, or where he is now, right? He's talking about, I am the student who works on things. I am the student who won't give a second thought to doing this. I am the one person who is willing to get out of my comfort zone and do this one thing. And I think what's important to remember here is, in some sense, it can be confusing to break down an essay just because of how organic an essay becomes. Right? You can see all these different parts, and some might describe the inciting incident as different than what I described in the essay. But what's important here is that you have these structural elements in your essay. And what I think is important is for you to identify what that means for you. So what was the inciting incident for you? What was the challenge for you? How did you resolve that? What did you do? And I think Rashawn makes a good point about a better way to maybe conceptualize the inciting event in a story that we all kind of are familiar with, which is that, we all know the Cinderella story. A poor girl who lost her mother, lived with her dad and stepmother and stepsisters, and of course they all hated her. The inciting event was the ball is announced, right? The status quo was that she was a poor girl, her real mother died, she has a stepmother, and her stepmother and all her stepsisters all hate her. That's the status quo of the story. The inciting incident, something happens to to Cinderella. oh, she finds out about a ball. And so now she's trying to get to the ball. And now she's like, oh, you know, what can I do about this? What can I do about this? And then, of course, what ends up happening during the raising the stakes is that her stepmother and stepsisters don't allow her to go. But turning incident, turning point, fairy godmother comes up, grants her wish, right? And so from there on out, you can see how the story evolves. Of course, in these kind of stories, it can be a lot easier to distinguish them from maybe your own experience. You know, as somebody said in the chat, sometimes raising the stakes and turning point are interwoven with what I did. I think that's important. And then what I would do there is I would make a conscious note of that. And so talk about these 2 points seem to be very, very important, but also like they said, very interwoven together. And so you can write it in that way in your essay. But what I would do is before you go into your essay and before you write it, make sure that you have a clear delineation or a clear point of reference for what those things are, so you know what they are. And I hope that was helpful. And again, if you have any more questions, feel free to type in the chat, and we would be more than willing to answer some questions. Yes, so with regards to elaborate more on how these things can be interwoven. For me, I think a good example would be in this essay. So, and this is more of this is something else, but I can see it in this essay. So for example, if we were to look at, let's see, no, not bowling, we're looking at this one. So if we're looking at this essay with debate, of course, this was a type A. So they talk about kind of the final act and the status quo. See, for me, I think somewhat the final act and the status quo were kind of interchanged here. Here, what I think you see in this paragraph, which starts with more importantly, it says, I confront issues instead of avoiding them. Again, this is kind of explaining what he learned, but also explaining the status quo. Designed to discover solutions to problems that affect others, as I was able to do as a part of the first place team for the 2010 United Nations Global Debates Program. So what we see here is that the status quo is linked with the final action, because you might say that the first place for the 2010 UN Global Debates, that was something that occurred, you know, prior. That's an example of final action, but the author includes it in his kind of status quo because it's harkening back to. So you can see how those are interwoven there. But if we go to bowling, we can also see this, I think, in this paragraph down here. So the author says, in the 11th grade, my father suffered a muscle failure, and he continues about what happened with his family. And so here we see there is rising action, right? So in some sense, things are getting worse, but also the real challenge that he faced was, I think anyways, was him being put out of commission, of him not being able to help his family. And so here we see in that paragraph, I think, a good example of how two things are kind of being addressed at the same time. And while it might be confusing to kind of parse out what each individual aspect of that paragraph is, as you read it, it makes a lot of sense to you. And it's not something that you, that is really any issue with regards to reading the story. You can absolutely write about spiritual challenges. One thing that I will say about that, though, is oftentimes when you're writing about something like that, it can be hard to, or what you need to do when you write about something, some kind of like intellectual challenge or spiritual challenge, is you need to write about how it affected you concretely. So for example, my faith was challenged. What I did was I spent time doing studying. So that's a concrete effect of my spiritual or faith challenge. And in the same way, you need to be seeing how you can make your challenges concrete. Because if you're reading an essay and all somebody is saying is, I was challenged, it was hard for me to deal with this, you know, that's a lot more boring of a story where somebody talks about why it was hard, what actually happened to them in light of that. So yes, you can write about a spiritual challenge, but make sure you make that challenge concrete and those effects concrete. Sabina, are you saying, so you said how we could connect several not so big changes? Do you mean challenges with one like significant challenge? Um, so with regards to embellishing a little bit of your story, I wouldn't, so for me, I think it's always hard to tell what is an ethical way to tell a story, because for me, I tell like basic stories from my childhood, which are honest stories, but I do put a little more flavor into the stories now that I'm telling them back to an audience, right? So if I tell about a story when I, broke, one of my bones, I'm going to tell that in a way that is most entertaining to my friends. Now, could you say that I embellish it in some way? Perhaps, but I never lie in my stories. And I think that is where we need to be, where we need to for real, like there is a line, like if you lie, like that is not ethical to do in your story. And I think it's important to, like, what does embellish mean? For me, if you are telling a story and it is honest and you feel that it is honest, then I think that that is okay. And if you can justify that, so if it's honest and you can justify what you are saying, I think it's okay. Now, Roshan, you might have something else to add to that, and I'd be more than willing to hear what you have to say. But that's kind of my thought process on that. Is that to some extent, um, telling a story does to some extent involve that, but I think you really have to be honest with yourself. Is this an unethical way of going about telling the story? Yes. So Naria asked, should events be described in a chronological order? Largely, yes. In both of the stories that or in both of the essays that we just read, that's the way it was told. But that's also the narrative structure of something, right? You have cause and effect. So one event leads to another, which is chronological order. Now, one thing that I will say is that if you look at the beginning of this essay, right, you have an attention-getting device that is not in chronological order, but the reason or the purpose for that story, you could say, or that example, is to introduce the story. And so that's different. But overall, your story should be, if you're writing in narrative format, should be in chronological order. Yes, good question. Yep, absolutely. Very happy to hear that. Very happy to hear that. And again, this is a very long process, and it's a process that requires a lot of focus and it can be very, very hard, but it's something that hopefully you guys benefited from and will be able to use in the future. Yeah, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure. It's always a pleasure. Yes, thank you all for coming as well. I very much appreciate it. Rashawn, I'm not sure if you want to close out the meeting or if we still have a few minutes for questions or what your plan is. Okay, yes, yes, absolutely. Again, thank you so much for coming, and I'm sure I will see you all at the next session.